Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 Orientalist operas, marvelous Orientalist operas, luscious, exotic, and culturally appropriative. You got it. You know, when I did the first list of Orientalist orchestral music, there were a bunch of comments about, oh my God, I used the term Orientalism. I mean, it's a loaded political term. It's a pity. It's a pity it's a loaded political term because, let's put it this way. Just because Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, which tried to turn it into a dirty word, that doesn't mean it has to be. I don't accept that definition, and I couldn't care less about it. You know, academia generally, is always looking for ways to reinvent language, to redefine things. And that's a good thing. This is what these people do. I was one of them. In a way, I guess I still am one of them. You know, you deal with ideas and you find, evidence, and you create new ideas out of old ideas or reconsider them. And, that's what academics do. It works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. Orientalism as a redefined term doesn't work. The idea behind the bad definition of Orientalism, which is that it's a form of cultural imperialism, essentially, a means of asserting the dominance and superiority of Western culture to all other cultures. Well, there is that. There is something to that. But that doesn't mean that the word itself needs to be redefined in that way entirely, because behind that, before Edward Said wrote Orientalism, there was a wonderful tradition of Orientalist study, scholarship, literature, much of it extremely thorough, very respectful. And, and what does any of this have to do with opera? I mean, really. Orientalist opera is essentially a fairy tale. Exotic locations, supernatural happenings, mythology, all of these things. Opera is such a dirty medium. It's eclectic. It mixes everything together. That's the whole meaning of the word opera. Opera, the plural of opus, works of. It's a jumble. It's music and dance and this and scenery and stuff. And people love fairy tales. People love to imagine exotic locations, placing things elsewhere allows the composer sometimes to explore relationships and happenings and things that you wouldn't encounter in your daily life and that you might be horrified if you did. So it's nice to sort of remove them someplace else. And if, the place that it gets removed is looked on as somehow, creepy or scary or inferior, who cares? Seriously, folks, it's just entertainment, and it's very, very entertaining entertainment. It's good entertainment. So let's talk about these 10 marvelous Orientalist operas and embrace them for the delicious and fabulously rich compositional efforts that they are. Number 1, Puccini, Madame Butterfly. Come on, it's the iconic Orientalist opera, isn't it? It takes place in Japan. And remember, the Western people are the bad guys. So you can't say that you're looking down on another culture. Puccini was extremely concerned with trying to create an authentic, valid, view of Japan's music, local color, and also its moral code in Cho-Cho-san's Dignity and Suicide, which of course could never have happened in a Western country where suicide is a religious no-no. So there you have a very, very interesting example of Orientalism in art, and one in which the imperialist power, the West, is not treated with a great deal of sympathy. So there you go. Next, Mozart, the Abduction from the Seraglio, however you want to pronounce that thing, the harem. Isn't that easier? The idea of using these exotic destinations and things like that, goes back a long, long ways. And it first infected, if you want to use the word, Western art, in light of the war against between the Viennese or the Austrians and the Turks in the 17th century. And remember, the Turks got very close to taking Vienna at one point. And after that, these Turkish music locale setting things became extremely popular. I mean, lots of people did them. And, Haydn wrote one and Gluck wrote one. Actually, Haydn and Gluck wrote the same one, L'Incontro Improviso, or the Rencontre Imprévue, or however you do it in French. It's the same story. They're all the same story. They're about virtuous Western woman is kidnapped by virtuous harem owner, sultan or something, who's usually a speaking role, and she gets rescued by her boyfriend. And everything turns out happily ever after, because it turns out that the sultan has enough women in his harem, and he's impressed by their constancy and their general moral probity, and so it all works out well in the end. Again, it's the exotic locale that just makes it fun. You get to write all kinds of interesting music, as Mozart does, with percussion and stuff and other goodies. Gluck also wrote, by the way, a fascinating little one-actor called The Chinese Women, which has a delightful overture, which originally had all kinds of percussion, which the parts of which have disappeared. So we can't play it the way it was originally intended, but it was originally performed in a garden with lights at night, and it was supposed to be really lovely and exotic. The music has no exoticism in it whatsoever. The Chinese women are just talking about the meaning of art, which is what Chinese women always do, I guess. Anyway, I mentioned that it's not in this list. Well, I guess it is now, but because there's no real influence in the music itself. But still, I mean, these ideas of just relocating stuff. It's a convention. Nothing more than that, as often as not, unless you're like Puccini or Mozart, when you're trying to give something of the flavor of the locale to which your story has been transplanted. Next, Busoni Turandot. Well, Turandot, think of it this way. Turandot as an opera is kind of a recent sort of thing, but it was originally a play by Carlo Gozzi, which was first staged, I think it was in 1672, something like that. It's a 17th century commedia dell'arte play with an exotic setting. So that's really kind of astonishing. And it's been a plot line that runs like a thread through Western music. I mean, Busoni wrote a suite originally of incidental music for the play, as many composers did. It has tons of incidental. Weber did Turandot. Lots of people did Turandot. And then finally decided to turn it into an opera himself. It's quite different from a certain more famous Turandot by Puccini, which we'll get to in a bit. And it's a lovely work. It uses green sleeves, which Busoni somehow thought was a Chinese tune, which is kind of amazing. And the idea behind Turandot doesn't involve any sort of Western influence at all in this particular case, because it's just a story about a princess, who says she will not get married, and a foreign prince. They're all Oriental in this story, and Liu, the slave girl, and all that stuff. Well, Busoni's version is very different, because the original was not meant to be tragic or taken all that seriously. It was a comedy, and so, or at least a satire, and so Busoni picks up on that angle a little bit more thoroughly. It's a wonderful work. It's short. It's fun to listen to, and you can go and find it. It's been recorded a couple times, and that's great. Next, Holst Savitri. Holst appeared in our list of Orientalist orchestral works because Holst was a Sanskrit scholar. He was fascinated by that part of the world at that period. Savitri is an Indian story, an Indian myth about a woman who cheats death. The old woman who cheats death story, like The Dove. Remember The Dove, that fabulous movie short where where the woman has a badminton game with death over the soul of her lover. Well, Savitri doesn't exactly have a badminton game with death, but it's a stunning, austere, beautiful chamber opera for double string quartet and I think a couple flutes and an oboe or something, just a tiny, tiny ensemble. It lasts about 40 minutes or so, and it's exquisite. It's absolutely exquisite and very, very, I mean, just profoundly beautiful. After Savitri, we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, number 5, Rimsky-Korsakov, The Golden Cockerel, Le Coq d'Or. It's his last opera. Rimsky-Korsakov's operas are all Orientalist, or a lot of them are. I mean, one of the things about Russian music is that you can't claim that Russia was ever culturally appropriating because Orientalist motifs and stories and territories are part of Russian culture. Russia goes all the way out to Japan, let's not forget. And so when Russian composers turn to these stories, whether they're fantastical or historical, they are as legitimately theirs as anybody else, as anything else. That's what happens when you run like an enormous empire. So Le Coq d'Or, of course, is fabulous. I mean, it's just a wonderful story. The suite's wonderful. The story is fun. It's delightful. I mean, and I don't think anybody's accused Rimsky-Korsakov of being a cultural appropriator or anything like that, anything silly. His Orientalist music is the real deal. It comes out of his tradition, out of Pushkin, who wrote most of the stories that Rimsky-Korsakov later adapted. And, they're all fairy tales. They're delightful and wonderful and exotic and colorful fairy tales. And they should just be enjoyed for what they are. Masterful pieces, really masterful. Massenet Thaïs. Thaïs is a sort of take on the hooker with a heart of gold story, which is really kind of fun. Thaïs is a courtesan, and she is beloved by what's his name, Nathaniel or something like that. I don't know, some guy who's like a religious zealot, and he winds up, miserable. Thaïs dies, of course, but that's okay. He winds up absolutely miserable. It takes place in Egypt, mostly. And so, Massenet wrote a whole bunch. I mean, French operas and romantic operas full of that sort of stuff. We talked about Delibes Lacmé at one point in one of my other talks, which is another, Orientalist masterpiece. And Thaïs, again, the clash of cultures in Thaïs is a religious one. It's a spiritual one. And Massenet's point being that the courtesan can be far more moral than the religious zealot, which is probably a good lesson for everybody. I really think it's probably a useful little tidbit to take home. But Massenet wrote a bunch of other religious things. There's Hérodiade, and there's Le Roi de Lahore, and Esclarmonde, which is sort of like, the national anthem of Byzantium. It's wonderful stuff. And did he have a luscious, glittering, gorgeous orchestral technique. I mean, the opera itself is kind of, people like to sort of dump on it because they think, well, Massenet is sentimental. And because he's sentimental, people think he's kind of cheap and trashy, but he wasn't. He took all of these subjects very, very seriously and filled them full of really sincere, warm, wonderful, and sometimes exotic music. Sometimes he used a saxophone, as in Le Roi de Lahore. Now, there's an Orientalist instrument, right? Wrong. But boy, is it fun stuff. So after Thaïs, here's a novelty. Leoni, L'Oraculo, the Oracle. Leoni's opera actually is Orientalist in that it takes place in Chinatown in San Francisco. And that's a double exotic location because for European composers at that time, the United States was as good as, Indonesia for exotic locales. I mean, that was Puccini's Girl of the Golden West, set it in the West. Verdi's original in Ballo and Mascara was, the censors insisted it be moved to Puritan Boston. I mean, different time, different place, just get it out of here. Get it out of Europe. So it takes place in San Francisco's Chinatown and in like an opium den. It's a one-act verismo kind of cheap and fun. And Joan Sutherland recorded it, which is kind of amazing. She and her husband were always running around for, looking for interesting corners of the repertoire to uncover. And one of the things they unbaked was this thing. I mean, there's an opium den owner, the bad guy, gets strangled with his own pigtail at the end. It's just really, really kind of fun. And if you come across it, you may want to give it a shot. It's really a novelty, and it's not long, and it's fun and breezy, and full of heavy, hot, thick, romantic excess. And one of the things you look for in a good Orientalist opera is excess. You have to have excess, as much excess as you could possibly pack into it. And speaking of excess, Mascagni's Iris, or Iris, if you want to be, anglicize it. Iris is, it's Madame Butterfly on steroids, if you want to put it that way. There's a wonderful set number that was famous for like 10 minutes called The Hymn to the Sun. It takes place in Japan, and Iris is a lovely, sweet little girl who falls in with a bad crowd, bad people, and as a result of this, she gets condemned and rejected by her family and dumped in a sewer. And the last act takes place in a sewer. It's about as beautiful an opera, about as miserable a situation as anybody could ever come up with. It's really amazing. And it was popular during the Verismo Revolution, in the early decades of the 20th century, because they were just big, yummy, gushy pieces in which people scream and shriek and suffer and torture each other. And, the fact that it's in an exotic setting is just a bonus. That's the icing on the cake. But Iris has sort of a cult following among opera people because it really is just lovely, and also because, it's Madame Butterfly on steroids. You want to see, you thought Puccini treated his little girl roles badly. These women who are sweet and innocent and who die for love. Well, Iris is on a whole nother level. It's about as far as you could go with that concept. Now, I imagine, whether or not the Orientalists will get upset, the feminists definitely will. There's a whole issue of gender. We could talk about that. We could do gender-bending, masochistic Orientalist operas as well. There are just so many issues, according to modern academia, with these juicy, sometimes a little trashy Verismo Orientalist, whatever. I mean, you could get yourself completely twisted into knots if you take these things too seriously. And so we don't, and we shouldn't. So after Iris, of course, Sullivan The Mikado. I mean, come on. How could we leave out The Mikado? It's the quintessential Orientalist operetta. It takes place in Japan, sort of. A Japan which is strangely similar to Victorian England in its class consciousness and in its the usual Gilbert and Sullivan plot. It's a masterpiece. A screaming masterpiece. The music is amazing. The setting is so witty and farcical. And the wonderful thing about The Mikado, actually, is that it really does kind of blow up the whole Orientalist critique, because all of the characters are obviously British, and they're self-consciously Japanese. They're all singing in, the finale, and they try and do Japanese, but they can't. They sing the Japanese equivalent of here, here, here. And the girls, 3 little maids from school are we, for the ladies. That whole thing where they're, we're walking along in our little Japanese way. And they just make fun of the whole thing constantly throughout the story. And it's just great. It's just great. I mean, they really should tie all these people who think Orientalism is an evil imperialist plot and just force them to listen to the Mikado for the rest of their lives, because that's exactly the approach we should be taking to all of this stuff. It should be just something to scoff at And the Mikado is just amazing that way. And last but not least, oh gosh golly, Puccini's Turandot. The other Orientalist masterpiece. Well, as you know, it was incomplete when Puccini died. It was completed quite horribly by Franco Alfano. Others have tried to complete it equally horribly. The music is stunning, and it's got tuned gongs and tam-tams and authentic Asian melodies or Chinese melodies. It's just, it's wonderful. It would have been a masterpiece if Puccini had finished it. It still is, up to the point where Liu dies. At which point Puccini died, which was kind of appropriate because she's the little girl who suffers and dies for love. She kills herself when they're trying to find out Kalof's name, so Turandot won't have to marry him. And I've always, I have my own completion for the whole thing. I really do. I think that what should happen is that it should return to its commedia dell'arte roots. That's the characters Ping, Pang, and Pong, who are a little bit comedic sometimes. And at the end of Turandot, when Kalof and Turandot have admitted that they love each other and all that, Ping, Pang, and Pong ought to come back very cynically and just look at them and go, ugh! Oh my God, is anyone believing this crap? And they walk up to Turandot and Kalof and they go, Principessa Divina, we quit. Bang, end of opera. And that would be really kind of fun, I think. But, because they're the best characters of the whole opera, of course. And they get all of the Orientalist music. That amazing scene at the beginning of Act 2 with Ping, Pang, and Pong running around preparing for the riddle scene and the executions that will follow and all of that stuff. It's wonderful, heartbreakingly beautiful music. And the only really human music, in the entire opera, as far as I'm concerned. Because Kalof is a pig and Turandot's just annoying. And, I think that it really is an extraordinary commentary on the whole idea of, Orientalist opera because the setting, China, the setting is, again, it's not an East meets West clash. It's an East meets East clash. Of cultural values, and there's no way that Kalof and Turandot finally getting together is going to be a convincingly happy ending. That was Puccini's problem, really. He wanted Turandot to become a living, breathing, pulsating, heaving, woman, flesh and blood. Nah. You ever seen Turandot? You think that's going to happen? No way. But it doesn't matter because the music is stunning and absolutely gorgeous. And the piece is again, like as Chinese as Puccini could make it, coming from Italy. It's as Chinese as my grandmother's living room. She always insisted that every room needed to have a piece of Chinese in it. And I couldn't agree more. All of us need to have a piece of Chinese or, Oriental in our lives, in our musical lives, because it's a major, major current in Western musical culture. And it's not a major current because it was an attempt to demean or diminish. It's just the opposite. It was an attempt to wow us with exoticism and create superior entertainment. And I'm 100% for that. Entirely. So there's the list, my friends. I think there are some things here that you may not know, that you may want to discover. I hope you'll take some time to do so if you can find them. And just enjoy your Orientalist operas. Gosh, they're fun. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.